Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Supradeep Das, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all to another edition of the ICS Wednesday seminar titled Negotiating Statelessness, Tibetan Youth, Citizenship, and Exile Politics in India. Today's presentation will examine the evolving political agency of Tibetan youth in India as they grapple with the complexities of statelessness and citizenship. While the Central Tibetan Administration historically positioned statelessness as vital to the Tibetan struggle, it paradoxically encouraged migration to the West for international advocacy. This stance has led to tensions while the exile community, particularly among second and third generation Tibetans, who increasingly challenge the CTA's approach. Some seek Indian citizenship for rights and mobility, while others remain committed to the exile identity but demand greater socio-economic opportunities. Drawing on ethnographic research, the speaker will highlight how Tibetan youth are reshaping exile politics through activism, legal battles, and transnational engagement, shifting Tibetan nationalism beyond a state-centric approach to negotiate belonging in multiple political spaces. This analysis will also offer broader insights into refugee governance, identity formation, and evolving meaning of political membership in exile. The speaker for today's seminar is Ms. Kalyani Yola. She is a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. She recently submitted her PhD thesis titled Negotiating Nation and Citizenship, an ethnographic study of Tibetan youth in exile in India at BITS Pilani KK Birla Goa campus. Her research focuses on geopolitics, foreign policy, nationalism, citizenship, and the evolving dynamics of the New World Order. She also engages with critical perspectives on human rights, migration, and refugee policies. Her work has been published in The Diplomat, The Financial Express, Modern Diplomacy, Deccan Herald, and Raisina House. The chair for today's seminar is Dr. Sherin Chorum Bhutia. She is an associate professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her areas of interest include negotiation theory, Sino-Tibetan negotiation, domestic sources of China's foreign and security policy, the Tibet question in China and internationally, and China's nationality policy, among others. She has written and spoken on these issues at various national and international forums. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to request all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All the participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box or along with your affiliation. Alternatively, you may also use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself and put your question. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Dr. Bhutia.
Thank you, Suradip. Okay, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's good to be back at ICS, even though virtually. Welcome everyone to this Wednesday seminar this afternoon. And I'm happy to see Kalyani, Dr. Kalyani, I should say, had the opportunity to meet you once. And I think it's a fascinating topic that you're working on. I'm grateful to ICS for this opportunity to chair this session today. I would say it's a pertinent and also a timely topic for discussion. The topic, as suggested, is negotiating statelessness, Tibetan youth, citizenship, and exile politics in India. I would say not much studies have been carried out as should have been on the topic, given that the Tibetan population is based here primarily in India. There have been quite a few studies lately, and most notable among them, I think, by Dr. Sonika Gupta from IIT Chennai, and also her associate, Dr. Madhura Balasubramaniam. They've done some really, I think, interesting research and looking at, I think, also, which is slightly contrasting with what is going to be discussed today, not contrast, but complementing perhaps, looking at the policy context within which Tibetans find themselves negotiating statelessness in the political context of India, in the local context of India, different opposing dynamics that they faced in various countries throughout the country. So research field studies have been conducted in Tawang, West Kameng by Dr. Sonika, and I'm aware that they've also done some research in Karnataka settlements, in Delhi, and some in Himachal as well. So I'm interested in further what Dr. Kalyani has looked at. So looking at that political context, in effect, so we are aware about some of the constraints that are posed by these policy frameworks. Especially, they've looked at the rehabilitation policy of 2014 and how the challenges that were faced, especially in Tawang, they've discussed, the intersection between indigeneity, marginality, historicity of the Tibet issue per se, the settlement in these regions, and then how it leads to some sort of competition, let's say, for scarce resources, land resources, and the oppositional politics, and all of them combined leads to some sort of exclusionary ethnopolitics in that sense. So that is the dimension that they come from. And I think there we also see that the scope for agency, as Dr. Kalyani is looking at, is very limited in that sense. So here, I think Dr. Kalyani is focusing specifically on the Tibetan actors, as far as I can see from the abstract. One of the main actors she's looking at is the Tibetan youth and their exercise of political agency. And I think this is an important aspect that needs to be looked at. And her study is based on ethnographic research. And it says that it would be bringing about important elements, I think, about how the Tibetan youth perceive their marginality and the precarity within this context, and the various means and methods that they apply, to negotiate the multiple political spaces that they find themselves in. However, having said that, Dr. Kalyani also places the Tibetan administration and the Tibetan youth in opposition, in somewhat kind of an opposition to each other. I mean, you can maybe qualify that further in some sense, with the Tibetan youth as the protagonist in the story and the central administration as the anti-protagonist of sorts. So maybe I'm putting this a little bit too simplistically, but just for setting the tone, you can maybe add to that and clarify that, or maybe just reiterate it. Okay, so that is one thing I think. Just as a way of provocation, also I thought I should highlight that, and I think it also generates all the more interest in the research that you've conducted. Specifically with regards, I don't want to take away too much of the discussion time, but with regards to the research, the abstract mentions that the CTA encouraged Tibetan migration to the West, expecting the diaspora to advocate for Tibet internationally. And I think a number of issues emerge here. The Tibetan administration, according to the study, has worked towards constraining the youth from accessing Indian citizenship, which also then bars them from so many other, opportunities. While at the same time, it's encouraging them to migrate to the West and take up Western citizenship. I think this, presents very important, like you've put it, paradoxical kind of a situation of the CTA. Important questions are emerging here in that sense. Firstly, I would say for us to lay it out in that sense in a very systematic and, out there on the table, what are the kind of arguments that are put forth by the administration for such a policy, really? Secondly, how are these expectations with regards, that the Tibetans need to be rallied for this larger Tibetan struggle? So how are these expectations really communicated, and how have they been received by the Tibetan youth that Dr. Kalyani has interviewed? I'm sure those would come out in the course of the presentation. And considering that the Exile administration itself is in a somewhat marginal political position, how is it able to do this really? How effective is it in its ability to prevail over the Tibetan youth, so to say, right? So, is it based on some sort of moral persuasion, or are there systematic attempts at coercion or threat of penalization? Anything that, by way of evidence, that you're going to be able to put forth, or is there some sort of incentivization, alternatively, for remaining stateless? So in some sense, I think these are numerous questions that are there that we need to engage with, and without sidelining the fact that it's a complex issue, And there are indeed multiple constraints on all sides of the spectrum, whether it's the Tibetan youth, Tibetan population, or the central administration itself. Okay, so how to explain this paradoxical position of the administration, and what may be the underlying reasons for this approach, where citizenship of one is seen as more favorable over another. So I think from an Indian perspective, we would really like to know this. And especially I thought just to also come to the present, in the current context, the reality is that notably the number of Tibetans in exile have been dwindling. So I was just doing a quick reading online, and there is a survey of Tibetans in exile that was conducted by the Tibetan administration in around 2009, and the number was at about 94,000. And there was another census then in December 2020, and this I'm taking from the website fayul.com. It says there were about 72,312 in December 2020. And then in 2022, the number really falls down to 66,000 Tibetans, not just in India, but the subcontinent in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, where the Tibetan settlements are based. So we could attribute various reasons for this. Perhaps migration to the West, as you say, has been facilitated by the or encouraged by the exile administration, or it could also be that a lot of them are returning back to Tibet. I mean, it would be nice to know if you have some sense of the numbers, or could it also be more people are taking to naturalization in India itself? And also the other fact is that the number of Tibetans coming from Tibet into India now is barely in one digit. So as per one data for 2024, there were just about 8 who managed to come to India. So by implication, I think this presents also for the study a number of complex, I think, questions, and also a situation for the CTA itself. Apparently, actually, quite a few schools, and I'm not really aware about the numbers exactly. There may be studies that have been done on this, that some schools have been closed down that are being managed by the exile administration, and some monasteries also are not sure they're closed, but they are also short of admissions. And as a result, so I am just trying to pose some of these current problems that may be there, exacerbating the problem for the CTA as if from your perspective as the anti-protagonist, does that lead to some sort of exacerbation in their, quest for then acting as this constraining factor on the Tibetan youth's access to citizenship and them remaining stateless? So I thought you could look at some of these things, and also on your research per se, if you could also look at, if you've looked at and you could bring it out, the diversity of, on the differing levels of marginalization that is there within the Tibetan youth itself, or the Tibetan people themselves. So there are people who've, come to India prior to 1987, and, those who are after 87. So that, makes them ineligible for certain kind of rights. So if you've looked at that, and what kind of, so if you could highlight that in terms of the methodology that you've adopted for your study, and how you've been gone about selecting your case studies, and your sampling of the interviewees. So I think that would be useful for us as scholars to look at. And once again, I would congratulate you on this on submission of your PhD thesis. And I think this promises to be a very interesting presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to learning more from you. Over to you, Dr. Kalyani. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Sharing. You posed a very good questions for me to look forward. Also, thanks to ICS for inviting me to present my work at this platform. So today my talk examines how the Tibetan youth in India navigates their statelessness, their citizenship aspiration, and their demand for belongingness. So I'll explore the historical and political context shaping their experiences, contradictions within the Central Tibetan Administration's policies, and how these young Tibetans are reshaping exile politics. So my insights are specifically based on extensive ethnographic research including interviews and fieldwork in Tibetan communities, specifically in the Tibetan settlement of Dharamshala and Majnukatila. So when we talk about the historical context of the Tibetan statelessness, it dates back to 1959 when China's occupation of Tibet forced the Dalai Lama and thousands of Tibetans. Can you change the slide, please? Next one. Next one, yeah. Forced the thousands of Tibetans into exile in India. So while India granted asylum to these Tibetans, it did not offer them citizenship, which aligned with the CTA's stance that statelessness preserved the Tibetan cause and reinforced aspirations for an eventual return. So as per Dr. Sharing said that the statelessness imposed by CTA on Tibetans and they are not allowed to take Indian citizenship is because there is always a demand from the Central Tibetan Administration that the Tibetan youth should refrain from living a life of luxury in exile so that they could continue to fight for the independence of Tibet. And that is why they should stay stateless, specifically in India. So, but however, this policy has significantly impacted the generations that actually born and raised in India, because they mostly, since being born in India, they mostly feel connected to the Indian language, Indian traditions, and they feel that they should be allowed to take the Indian citizenship, and they should also be allowed to shape their assets through rights and opportunities. But the CTA stance on citizenship has always been paradoxical. While they discouraged Tibetans from acquiring Indian citizenship, they have encouraged Tibetan migration to the Western countries. And this migration can be seen from 1990s when there was a policy of US and Canada which relocated Tibetans, like 100 families of Tibetans from India to the Western countries. So the Central Tibetan Administration believed that Tibetans who migrate to the Western countries will take the citizenship of those countries and act as the global diaspora that would bolster advocacy for Tibet, that will create an international platform for the advocacy for Tibet. So, but at the same time, this has created tensions within the Tibetan community, which the Tibetan youth, which was not able to migrate to the Western country due to their socio-economic conditions. As many second and third generation Tibetans in India, they felt trapped between their Tibetan heritage and their limitations imposed by statelessness. So they were the restricted access to education, employment, and political representation has left many young Tibetans to search for alternative ways to assert their rights within India. Can you change the slide? Next slide. So the this all led to the legal battle for Indian citizenship among the Tibetans. It gained momentum in 2008 when Namgyal Lagari Dolkar was denied a teaching position due to her refugee status in India. So her case led to landmark ruling recognizing that Tibetans born in India between 1950s and 1987 qualify as Indian citizens. So subsequent cases such as the Karnataka High Court's 2013 ruling and Lobsang Wangyal's 2016 petition further expanded legal pathways for the Tibetan community in India. However, despite these victories, young Tibetans still face bureaucratic challenges in obtaining official documentation. In 2017, there was a case that Tibetans took Indian citizenship, but the Indian government issued a statement where the Tibetans who have taken Indian passports were asked to submit their identity certificates and leave the Tibetan settlements where they are living because they have taken Indian citizenship. This stance of Indian government was very aligned with the Central Tibetan Administration stance. So that time, thousands of Tibetans have returned their Indian passports and just to keep the identity certificate, and to live in the Tibetan settlements because lacking the right to have this property rights, it was very difficult for them to move out of the Tibetan settlements. Can you change the slide? So beyond these legal battles, Tibetan youth also negotiate their statelessness in everyday ways. Many pursue entrepreneurship, informal employment, alternative documentation to bypass restrictions on higher education and property ownership. Some leverage Indian political networks, forming alliances with local organizations to advocate for their rights. Others also use their Tibetan identity as a form of cultural capital, working in NGOs and international advocacy spaces. These negotiations highlight their agency in creating viable futures despite systematic constraints. Tibetan youth challenges the assumption that acquiring Indian citizenship negates Tibetan identity. As one young Tibetan, while interviewing, explained that the assumption that gaining Indian citizenship means renouncing Tibetan citizenship is flawed. There is no legally recognized Tibetan citizenship today. What we are renouncing is our statelessness, not our Tibetan identity. Other Tibetans view Indian citizenship as a temporary measure, believing that they could renounce it if Tibet regains independence. So this perspective underscores how young Tibetans strategically engage with legal frameworks to navigate their exile status. Can you change the slide, please? So at the same time, Tibetan youth are not merely challenging the CTS policies, but they are also actively reshaping exile politics. Many of the Tibetan youth engage in grassroots advocacy, lobbying Indian politicians for greater rights. Youth-led initiatives have pushed for policy changes, including easier access to government services and documentation. Additionally, social media has also allowed young Tibetans to create new narratives of belonging, challenging traditional exile politics while maintaining a commitment to the broader Tibetan cause. Some young Tibetans question the CTA's insistence on statelessness as a form of political resistance. As one participant during the interview put it, the CTA covertly discourages Indian citizenship while Western citizenship is openly embraced. This double standard suggests that the concern is more about maintaining control over the exile community rather than protecting Tibetan identity. This criticism reflects a shift in exile politics, where young Tibetans prioritize tangible rights over symbolic political gestures. Can you change the slide, please? So while the CTA has promoted migration to the West to strengthen global advocacy for Tibet since 1990s, this has not always been a successful strategy. There was a rise of neoliberalism that has transformed refugee policies, shifting from humanitarian aid to economic self-sufficiency. This neoliberalism expected Tibetan Tibetan migrants struggle to balance these neoliberal demands for productivity with their commitment to the Tibetan cause. In the Western countries, Tibetans are often seen as model refugees, expected to integrate quickly and contribute economically. However, this pressure to assimilate can weaken ties to the Tibetan movement. One of the Tibetan participants noted, "We must constantly prove our Tibetanness while also being productive workers. If we are seen as too focused on Tibet, we are marginalized. If we integrate too much, we risk losing our identity." So unlike in India, where Tibetan settlements provide a sense of community, Tibetan migrants in the West often live dispersed lives, making it harder to sustain Tibetan activism. So these challenges have fueled a stronger demand for Indian citizenship. Many young Tibetans now see legal recognition in India as a more viable option than migrating to the West, where economic stability does not always translate into cultural or political security. One of the participants said, Gaining citizenship does not automatically resolve the difficulties of exile. Many Tibetans in the West face unemployment, discrimination, and a weakening sense of belonging. Indian citizenship at least provide a legal foundation for stability without completely severing ties to the Tibetan cause. At the same time, the question of citizenship of India deeply influences the Tibetan identity in exile, shaping how Tibetans navigate their political and cultural status. For decades, the Central Tibetan Administration has emphasized the importance of maintaining a distinct Tibetan identity framed around the hope of one day returning to an independent Tibet. The exile community has thus framed refugee status not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a necessary component of the struggle to preserve national identity. This emphasis has been reinforced by structures such as green books, which serve as marker of Tibetan belonging despite displacement. However, in recent years, a shift has emerged, particularly among younger generations born and raised in India. The refugee identity that once symbolized resistance now increasingly feels like a burden, limiting access to rights, economic opportunities, and political participation. The demand for Indian citizenship is not necessarily a rejection of Tibetan identity, but rather a strategic move to gain stability while continuing to engage with the Tibetan cause. Many young Tibetans argue that acquiring Indian citizenship allows them to advocate more effectively within Indian political system rather than remaining on the margins. So when we talk about the conflict between Tibetan and Indian citizenship, this tension between the Tibetan and Indian citizenship reflects a broader conflict of identity and survival. While the CTA continues to advocate for the preservation of refugee status to keep the Tibetan struggle alive, many younger Tibetans feel the pressure to integrate into Indian society for economic security and personal advancement. This creates a dilemma between maintaining a distinct Tibetan identity and the reality of living without essential rights such as property ownership, voting, and legal documentation in India. Younger Tibetans thus increasingly question the idea that taking Indian citizenship means abandoning their Tibetan identity. They see citizenship as a means of escaping statelessness rather than as an act of renunciation. Many also recognize that Tibetan citizenship, in a legal sense, does not currently exist, making Indian citizenship a necessary legal safeguard rather than a rejection of their roots. So, for some Tibetans, Indian citizenship is also viewed as a practical temporary measure. There remains hope that if Tibet regains independence, those who have taken Indian citizenship today could later reclaim Tibetan citizenship. This perspective reframes Indian citizenship as a survival mechanism rather than a permanent break from Tibetan identity. The approach reflects a pragmatic engagement with legal frameworks while keeping alive the aspiration for a future Tibet. While at the same time, there is a contradiction of thought process between the Tibetan youth and the previous Tibetan generations. These older generations may see refugee status as a form of symbolic resistance. Younger Tibetans are more inclined to balance pragmatism with nationalism. The argument that Indian citizenship offers tangible benefits without diminishing their commitment to Tibet is gaining traction these days. Some point to Tibetans in the West who hold dual citizenship while continuing to engage in activism for Tibetan independence. One of the participants said, if Western Tibetans can maintain their identity while holding citizenship, why should the same not apply to Tibetans in India? Also, one of the participants said that the Tibetans who take Indian citizenship are isolated from the Tibetan community in India. So for many, securing Indian citizenship is not about abandoning the Tibetan cause, but about ensuring access to rights that would enable them to contribute more effectively to the movement. Citizenship provides economic stability, legal security, and political agency, which in turn can strengthen their ability to sustain Tibetan activism within India. So the Tibetan youth activism has emerged as a vibrant and multifaceted force, challenging traditional paradigms of exile and redefining the interplay between citizenship and cultural identity. In the context of growing demand for legal recognition and rights within India, young Tibetans are not merely reacting to external constraints, but are actively shaping their political and cultural futures. Their activism embodies a dynamic negotiation between the practical benefits of citizenship and the enduring importance of Tibetan heritage. Can you please change this slide? Yeah, the next one. At the heart of this activism, there is a commitment to cultural preservation. Recognizing that language, race, and traditional practices are essential markers of identity, Tibetan youth have launched initiatives such as the Lakar movement. This effort not only promotes the use of Tibetan language and traditional attire, but also serves as a deliberate act of resistance against cultural dilution. By preserving these cultural markers, young Tibetans reaffirm their connection to their historical roots and assert that their identity remains intact, irrespective of legal status or geographical location. They have also resorted to digital platforms. Digital platforms have further revolutionized Tibetan activism. Social media campaigns and online movements have enabled a broader, more immediate form of advocacy. Hashtags such as Free Tibet and Tibet Has Rights have mobilized global support, allowing young activists to bypass traditional media channels and directly engage with a worldwide audience. Beyond online efforts, grassroots organizing, international advocacy, and creative expressions in poetry, music, and films further enrich their activism. Tibetan youth activism represents a dual approach, securing legal rights while maintaining cultural integrity. In doing so, they redefine what it means to be Tibetan in exile, offering valuable insights into the future of identity politics and refugee governance. So to conclude, Tibetan youth in India are not, can you change the slide please? So to conclude, Tibetan youth in India are not merely adapting to exile, they are reshaping it. Through legal battles, activism, and engagement with Indian institutions, they are redefining political belonging beyond the binary of statelessness and citizenship. Their efforts challenge traditional notions of exile and offer valuable lessons for refugee communities worldwide. I think this is it, and I end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kalyani. I think that was a very good adherence to the time. And
Actually, the thesis is very big, and including everything in one presentation is very difficult. So I tried to put more about the citizenship and how they are trying to balance between both, that they want to take the citizenship, but at the same time, they are not alienating themselves from the Tibetan cause. So they are taking the path of activism to show that even if they take citizenship of India, they'll not leave their roots of Tibetan identity.
Sure. I think you've ended on a interesting note that it's not how they're negotiating the binary of statelessness and citizenship. And apart from the fact that the precarity of their situation, where they are under the pressure to also work for the larger issue, and at the same time also, consider the existential realities of access to various rights and primarily employment. I think these are issues that are actually quite serious and needs to be taken into account. And you've dealt overall with the narrative, the problems that they are facing, and how they are trying to deal with it. I was actually as I flagged in the beginning, also to get a sense of how representative is this, these views are. I mean, that would come out once we have access to your thesis in terms of, because you've said that your case study was in Dharamsala. So that would be a very unique location in that sense of people who are based there. So are they from the schools, or are they people working in the Exile administration, or are they people who've come there for pilgrimage? So it depends who are these people that you've really interviewed. And it's a, like I said, the diversity within this actor that you're trying to engage with and trying to get a sense about the problem they are facing and the problem, how they are negotiating with it. So narrative we get is that they are doing it by being able to balance it, right? So I would assume, I mean, without being too presumptive, I mean, you go to different parts of India, different settlements, and the story would change. And the fact of the matter, as I mentioned initially, is that the number is really come down. And while the CTA is encouraging them, so this fact also about the initial aspect, I wonder if it is how much of it is the perception that the CTA is pushing them to migrate. So you actually refer to the initial phase of migration that happens when the Tibetans move to these Western countries. So there is a push and there is also a pull factor, and there was
There
also
is also.
opportunity presented by those countries. So there was a reason for rehabilitation. Was it on their mind that these people will then develop into the vanguards of the Tibetan cause? Was it as outcome based and outcome determined in that sense? At that time, were they just in the 90s dealing with the exigency, social and economic issues? So I think we need to be more clearer on those aspects. I think more questions raised as a result. And once we get hold of your thesis, I think it's going to be better and clearer. And I think you're also going to be able to develop further. Yeah. And I think with that, I think we will open the floor. I'm sure there is going to be a lot of questions. So there are some questions in the chat, I guess. Yeah, there's some from Dondup Yalpo says, I have a few comments. So would you like to speak, or would you like to write the comments down? Suradeep, how do we go about?
I think he might put out his comments. Mr. Galpo, you are already co-host now. You can put your comments.
So, okay, fine. So sorry, I'm multitasking right now. I'm in office, so just to introduce to you my, I'm Secretary of Bureau of Information Dalai Lama in New Delhi. Sorry, multitasking. Right now in office hours. Today, I'm going to speak in my personal capacity, not in my official capacity. First of all, I would like to thank Kalyani ji. You have chosen a very relevant topic for research. But there are so many facts that I would like to invite you to please visit my office so that we could go through it. Like starting from CTA actively encouraging migration, not true. There was a phase, first 1,000, just as 3,000 are right now coming to, not true.
Yeah, it was during the period of 1990s and 2000.
There was a huge debate at that time, but then because of certain circumstances, it happened and it had repercussions. And there was a second phase, certain impoverished sections in the northeastern that was sort of like an organized migration, but certain sections. Then one. And then this whole thing about Tibetan youth, and I've just made a bullet point because there are so many things. Your interaction has been limited to Majuba Trila and Dharamsala. Both of these are not representative. We work. I'm based here in New Delhi, so my main job is to liaise with the government of India as well as all the foreign embassies based here So whenever I take them to Majhuga Tila, I say, first thing that I tell them is, please do not take Majhuga Tila as a Tibetan settlement. It's a transit hub, not a Tibetan settlement. If you want to go to a Tibetan settlement, go to South India. There are a lot of reverse migration happening right now. So that's a altogether different thing. We'll discuss it later. And then Tibetan identity path, if you take Indian citizenship, you do not lose Tibetan identity, or for that matter, Tibetan citizenship. Who is a Tibetan? All those who hold Green Book are Tibetan. But once you take Indian citizenship, you are no longer a refugee in India. You are a Tibetan Indian. That's the only difference. Okay. And then integration. I'm very proud to say, irrespective of whether Tibetans, here in India, have taken Indian citizenship or not, I'm very proud of the fact that, we are very well integrated into the Indian community at every level. But so far, we have not assimilated. That's the only difference. Irrespective of whether you have passport or not, we are already well integrated. You go to settlement, economically, culturally, socially, everything. Even our schools are very well integrated with the local Indian community at every level. And then, I'm sorry, I lost. There are so many, So I thank you very much for your interest in this very relevant topic, and so I invite you to have further discussions with us, And then, of course, lastly, when you talk about migration, I have these often discussions with, why are Tibetans, they're, so well looked after there in India. Why are they migrating to West and going abroad? And then I reported and I tell them that, so we are not living in an island, we are living in a globalized world. When Indians can, aspire to study in the world's best colleges and work in, Google, Microsoft, we Tibetans are also humans. So, our children, not like my parents, who are illiterate, have never been to school, our children, they're going to colleges, the globalized world, social media, so, they also want to go to world best colleges, work in, so therefore, aspirations have changed, so, times have changed, so, Tibetan community. But the challenge is, even let's forget about my comment is getting long, then let you know.
Yes,
Kalyani ji, I will invite you to visit me whenever you
I
have
think
time.
that's a good idea. I think
yeah.
But there will be a lot of other questions. Okay, I'll stop here.
I think it's a good idea to meet up and I think include that in your research. Get an alternate.
Yes, I think we need to broaden the materials, because there are so many things I just couldn't capture, because yours is limited to Tibetan views. I can understand there's a frustration, like but there are far more to it. So basically, there's a policy called Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy 2014. So how it's implemented, what it means, people into it.
Thank you.
That's just what. And my comments are personal, okay? It's not an official position. I'm just here to in my personal capacity. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gyalpo, for your intervention and bringing out the Exile administrations. Like you said, it's a personal view, so I think we cannot account for that as such. But yeah, and so there is a question in the chat. Suradeep, will you be reading it out or?
Yes, doctor, I will read it on the speaker. Yeah. So the question is from Mr. Anurag Khan. He has two questions. The first question is, has the Indian government or any political party actively campaigned for the provision of Indian citizenship to Tibetan refugees? If no, then is it because the Indian establishment is worried of not displeasing the CTA and lose its support?
Should I answer this question first? Okay, so there was no any political party that has actively campaigned for the provision of Indian citizenship. But if you see in 2024 elections, there were almost 2,000 Tibetans from the Dharamshala settlement who participated in the elections there. So there was a question that how Tibetans participated in the Indian in the Indian elections, whether they got the really they got the citizenship, or they only have the voting rights to participate in the elections. So this question came in front during that period, but there is no any political party as such which campaigns for the Tibetan citizenship. And yes, because in 2017, if you see the policy, when Tibetans applied for Indian citizenship, soon after that, there was an Indian policy where Tibetans were asked to resubmit their identity certificates there to leave the Tibetan settlements. So this was a policy of Indian government. So of course, Indian government and Central Tibetan administration work together to maintain the statelessness.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Yola. Then the second question is, back in 2021, there was an article published in the print which focused on the changing nature of Tibetan rap music, as well as third generation of Tibetan rappers whose lyrics focus more on issues like aspiration of good life, family relationships, and the need for personal freedom from social constraints rather than traditional topics such as Tibetan independence, China, or His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Is your thesis focus on such trends as exemplifying the divide between the Tibetan generations as alluded by you in your presentation?
Yes, I'm not specifically looking at the generational divide between the Tibetan youth, but I'm specifically looking at how the Tibetan youth of second and third generation exert their agency, and how they are trying to balance both this independence of Tibet, the aspirations of their parents, because independence of Tibet, this is something they carry as an oral history, as from their parents or grandparents. They have never for the youth, they have never been to Tibet, they have never seen Tibet. So for them, they can connect more with India than with Tibet. So for them, taking Indian citizenship become viable, because they for them Tibet is only a memory of their parents and grandparents. But at the same time, they are also trying to carry the the trauma of their parents and grandparents by involving in the activism, or the Lakar movement, which represent that every Wednesday Tibetans talk in Tibetan language, they wear Tibetan traditional attire, and at the same time they say that we can take Indian citizenship, but we will be connected to the Tibetan roots. That is what my thesis is specifically looking at. I have not looked at the rap music and films in my thesis. Yes.
Okay, so at present we don't have any more questions in the chat box, so we might wait for a few minutes.
Anything else you want to add in the meantime, Dr. Kalyani? You could please go ahead.
I like the way you asked me these questions, that these numbers I have added in my thesis, that what was the, in 1960s, there were almost 150,000 Tibetans, and how the number is now reduced to like 40% Tibetans have migrated, but there is no specific data available on the CTA website. So anywhere that either they all are migrated, or some have deceased, or some have taken Indian citizenship. So this data is not available in the public domain. So I expect the CTA should come in future to come with this data, so that it will be easy for researchers like us to see the trends of Tibetans, because there is no data also how many Tibetans have migrated and how many have taken birth in those countries, because that number is increasing, but that doesn't mean all are migrated. There are people who are born in the Western countries as well. So this data is very critical, and I think that's it.
Thank you.
We have one more question from Mr. Anurag. That is there any apprehension among the Tibetans seeking Indian citizenship of losing the perk offered by the CTA, such as housing and schooling in TCV schools after having become Indian citizen?
Yes, housing, they have to leave the Tibetan settlement if they take Indian citizenship. But schooling, I don't think there is such, because these days Tibetan schools are inviting Himalayan kids also to take education in the Tibetan schools, because the number of Tibetan kids is reducing. So those who have taken Indian citizenship, their kids are also enrolled in the Tibetan children village schools. But for housing, yes, they have to leave the settlements.
Any more questions? Otherwise, I think we do have a time. What shall we do, Suradeep?
Ma'am, we can wait, or as it is always already 4, so we can also end it up if there is no more questions.
I think there could be various reasons why we don't have questioning. I don't think it's a lack of curiosity. I think it's more the fact that this is not something that one discusses so much. I think in the larger geopolitics of the issue, Tibet is generally discussed in the context of, the border issue, or I think that's where it figures. And recently, I think in the context of the American policies, recent changes in American, the resolution that was passed in the context of the larger internationalization of the Tibet issue. So I think it's within those dimensions that this is discussed. And I think we are talking about a very population, or a section of people which feels marginalized per se, and who are in this precarious kind of a situation of, there is on the one hand the need to prove your allegiance to the cause, so to say. I think in that context, irrespective of some of the points also Mr. Gyalpo tried to bring out, and I think you were put in a defensive in a sense, I think, from the introductory remarks from my side also. But to be fair to you, I think that's a general presumption that there was some sort of maybe a pressure. It may or may not have been from the administration. I think that is why we need to lay it out if there was such a statement, policy, because to say something like that is also problematic without there being some evidence to, as a researcher, for me to say this, that, the CTA actively encouraged or discouraged taking of citizenship. Otherwise, if you are born in India, just by the fact that you are born, you are an Indian citizen before a particular period. So I think the nuances and the legalities also are not very clear among the scholars to ask a question. So that should be laid out. And there is some research actually that is there, and I actually was going through it. And then there's the question of, so these specific small things about the registration certificate, identity certificate, the yellow book, the Rangzen book, that the green book that Mr. Gyalpo was referring to. So while Tibetans are based in India and people are aware about the Tibet issue, the politics of, Sino-Tibetan relations, the negotiations that are going on, the position of the Dalai Lama that, Tibet, we are willing to be part of China, but we would like more autonomy. So people are aware about that, but people are not aware about these smaller, minor issues. They're not minor actually, but not really aware. So I think if you had laid those out, I think that would have also been interesting. So that's not for me to now go into. But yeah, I think apart from when I was getting to this point about the CTA as being the main culprit, so to say, but perhaps it's also the larger Tibetan community. The pressure also comes from the society. It's a societal pressure. So it's not like one actor you can pinpoint to. So it's a very complex and dynamic space that we're talking about. And within the youth also, there is it a divide, or is it just a sense that they feel obligated, but they actually feel equally nationalistic? So there are periods. So if you talk about 2008, then there was a period when there was massive protests all over the country, like spontaneously Tibetans coming together and getting together. So I think those are various nuances that need to be covered and looked at. But suppose this kind.
Yes, in 2008 only there was this Lagyari Dolkar case where she applied for Indian citizenship. It is mostly for the employment the Tibetans apply for Indian citizenship. Otherwise, they prefer staying refugees. If the Central Tibetan Administration officials also told me that these days they are not being able to provide employment to the Tibetan youth in the Central Tibetan Administration. So they are also not like encouraging but and discouraging the Tibetan youth to take citizenship. It's up to the youth if they want to take citizenship. They can, but then there are again certain rules that restrict these youth from taking citizenship, like those who have not taken Indian citizenship between 1950s to 1987. So if their parents have not taken citizenship, it becomes difficult for the Tibetans to take Indian citizenship because the rules are different for Tibetans. Tibetans can't take Indian citizenship by birth. They have to submit their documents to take the
Yes,
citizenship.
that it's because the
So,
parents have it, so they automatically issued that document. So
but automatically, to get it issued automatically, one of their parents should be Indian citizen. So that the document they have to submit to the government. There is one more question.
okay, good. So we are actually generating some interest, I believe. So yes.
Yeah, the question again is from Mr. Anurag. He's asking that is the sentiment of seeking Indian citizenship shared by young Tibetan members of organizations such as Tibetan Youth Congress and Students for a Free Tibet, given that the organizations mentioned above have different ideological positions, while Tibetan Youth Congress adheres to the middle way approach, Umayalum, and the Students for a Free Tibet advocates for Rangzhen independence.
So I think you could also mention among your interviewees, were there these youth from these various organizations?
The youth was from different backgrounds. So yes, there was a youth from Student for Free Tibet. There was a youth from Tibetan Youth Congress, and there was a youth that was politically passive, which was not politically active, but wanted to pursue higher education in the Western countries. So there is a diversity of youth that I have interviewed. And there are these two approaches within the Tibetan community. One advocates for complete independence of Tibet, and other to the middle way approach, which is the policy of Central Tibetan Administration as well. Yes, both advocate for independence, TYC and SFT, but I think TYC adheres to the middle way approach and SFT adheres to Rangzhen approach. So yes, both I have interviewed, and SFT people are more inclined towards Tibetan youth taking Indian citizenship than TYC.
So I think not to act as a corrector, but yeah, I think TYC's context is a bit different in that sense, and it is an organization that was there since a very long time.
I
So
think it was established by Dalai Lama.
So it does actually, it's presented for the longest time as in opposition to the middle way approach. So yeah, I think there, just by way of clarification. But yeah. Any further questions? So Suradeep, shall we then close if
Yes, Doctor, I think we don't have any questions in the chat box.
So then I think it's up to me now to then thank Dr. Kalyani, and there's also going to be a vote of thanks, I believe, from ICS. So thank you for this interesting presentation, and so I now hand over to Suradeep.
Thank you, Chair. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session. With this, we come to an end of today's seminar. We thank Ms. Kalyani Ola and Dr. Shering Chonzom Bhutia for gracing today's seminar with their presence, for giving their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICSS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar titled Engagement or Confrontation: Japan's Strategic Dilemma in Dealing with North Korea, scheduled for 12 March 2025. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you so much for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.